third Applying Psychology lesson. In today's lesson, you'll be hearing from both myself, Kate, and my colleagues, Caitlin and Helen. So I am a trainee business psychologist currently on my placement year at Zircon and B Talent from the University of Kent.
And I'm Helen Hargrave, and I'm a senior consultant at Zircon and B Talent.
Hi everyone, I'm Caitlin, and I'm a business psychologist at Zircon and B Talent.
So today's lesson will be on positive psychology. You'll first be hearing from myself about a bit of background and theory behind positive psychology to set the scene a bit, as well as some misconceptions that many people, including yourself, may have about the field. I will then pass you on to Caitlin, who will be outlining the benefits of positive psychology and the importance of distinguishing between happiness and pleasure. And then we'll be hearing from Helen, who will be focusing on how we can all use positive psychology to help us through the current COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, as we're all psychologists, and it is our duty to critically analyse studies and theories, Helen will also outline some criticisms of positive psychology, explaining that it may not actually provide all the answers. So what is positive psychology? Well, it's a science first and foremost, and as you can see here, it's typically defined as a scientific study of what makes life worth living. Now, this all sounds a bit different from the scientific study that we usually do in psychology, such as the diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders. In fact, what positive psychology seeks to do is, instead of focusing on what is wrong with people, the focus is shifted onto what is right with people and how to cultivate and use positive emotions to our advantage. So a good analogy here would be, instead of taking someone from a -8 to a -2, positive psychology focuses on taking someone from a 2 to an 8. And I thought you may want to know some background into the development of positive psychology as a field. And you may have heard of Martin Seligman, who's a psychologist famous for his early work on depression. Seligman came up with the theory of learned helplessness, which refers to the state that occurs after an individual has experienced a stressful situation repeatedly, leading to a belief that there's nothing they can do about the situation and it's totally out of their control. To give slight background into this theory, Seligman and his colleagues first observed this learned helplessness when experimenting on dogs. They would ring a bell before lightly shocking the dogs and would do this repeatedly until the dogs were conditioned to react to the bell, even before the shock had happened, and this is known as classical conditioning. Afterwards, Seligman placed the same dogs in boxes that had an electric shocking wire on one side and none on the other, and this was separated by a small fence that they could easily jump over. What was even more interesting was when shocked this time, the dogs didn't actually make an effort to jump over the fence to safety, and Seligman noticed that it was kind of as if the dogs had learned that there was nothing they could do about the shock, and so he named this learned helplessness. So now you're probably wondering how this all relates to positive psychology at all. Well, later down the line, psychologists, including Seligman, began to think that if we learn helplessness, and if we can do this, surely we can learn optimism as well. And this work began to inspire the rise of positive psychology as a field. So Seligman believed that there were 3 different paths to happiness. And as you can see here on the screen, they were named the pleasant life, the good life, and the meaningful life. And he emphasised that these can be totally independent of each other, so you can have one without the other, so you can have the pleasant life without the good life or the meaningful life, and so on. So the first is the pleasant life. And in this life, you would have as much positive emotion as you possibly can and learn the skills to be able to amplify these. An example of sources that can provide us all with positive emotion would be listening to your favourite album or watching your favourite TV show. And whilst the pleasant life is obviously a major path to happiness, it could almost be seen as an easy way out, so as you always have access to these sources of positive emotion. Also, its immediate effect actually is a major drawback, as these things can get old pretty fast. So when you have that first bite of chocolate cake, for example, this first bite is usually the best bite. But when you get to the 8th or 9th bite, it just feels like extra calories. Although the pleasant life isn't all about those immediate hits of pleasure, it's also about feeling excited, satisfied, proud, and so on. And in fact, research has found that these emotions can be connected to positive life outcomes, such as longer life expectancy and healthier social relationships. So also, we have a second path to happiness, which is the good life. And it's also known as the life of engagement. This life involves things like your role as a parent or a friend or a colleague, and is totally distinct to pleasure in a very important way, as it involves a concept called flow. And flow refers to a state of deep, effortless involvement. So this is when we're so absorbed in our work that we can't actually feel anything else. And this is completely different to the pleasant life, when we feel positive emotions, as these are raw and we know that they're happening. Instead, the good life allows us to not feel anything at all because of that intense concentration. And good examples of this would be having a great conversation with one of our friends that we're totally invested in, or maybe a work project that we're very passionate about. The third is the meaningful life. And this refers to the discovery of your purpose, values, self-worth, and the belief that you can make a difference in the world. So an important aspect of this meaningful life, which is something that Caitlin will be discussing in greater detail later on, is knowing where your strengths lie and being able to use these in the service of something larger than yourself to make a difference in the world. So that could be volunteering for a charity, or maybe taking on a leadership role. So I've just outlined what Seligman considered to be the 3 paths of happiness in 2002. However, no psychological theory is that simple. And after nearly 10 years of further research, he actually realised that the meaningful life could be broken up into 3 different categories. And from this, he created the PERMA model, which you can see here. And the acronym stands for positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and purpose. So the pleasant life was now known as positive emotion, and the good life known as engagement. And the 3 elements that Seligman thought were part of the meaningful life were relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. So taking relationships in isolation, Seligman believed that these are crucial for building a meaningful life and for our overall well-being. And this book is about emotional and physical interaction, such as maintaining social connections that we have with people around us, whether that be going for a coffee catch-up with someone that you haven't seen in a while, or maybe, as we can't actually leave the house at the moment, organising a virtual pub quiz with your family and friends. As mentioned before, Seligman also believed that meaning is crucial to happiness. So having a sense of belonging to something bigger than us, whether that be religion, science, or social causes, or even going to work and actually having a better understanding of why you've turned up to the office an hour early today. These can all help us feel more satisfied in what we do. And lastly, Seligman noted that accomplishment is important for happiness. So we all need to have ambition and goals in order to help us reach this sense of accomplishment and achievement. And this helps us to thrive and flourish. So before joining this lesson, you may have already had some preconceptions about positive psychology, or maybe none at all. However, we thought it was necessary to iron out some of the misconceptions. So now that I've outlined the background and theory that underpins it, we will go through these. Firstly, although positive psychology seems like it's taking all the focus away from these negative emotions, this is not what it aims to do. In fact, positive psychologists view these negative emotions, such as pain or suffering, as very important aspects of our lives. However, would put a more positive spin on it, such as encouraging thoughts like, how can I actually profit from this setback in the future? Not only that, but positive psychology understands the useful purpose of negative emotions, such as fear and anger, as these can help to alert us to threats to our well-being and allow us to do something about them. Secondly, you should not confuse positive psychology with positive thinking or self-help. And whilst these are both underpinned by the idea of cultivating optimism, positive psychology is actually grounded in thorough academic research. And this means that its concepts are reliable and repeatable, whereas positive thinking mostly deals with anecdotal evidence. So now that I've addressed some of those initial misconceptions, I will pass you over to Caitlin, who will be discussing the impact of language we use around happiness and how its interpretation can be subjective.
So really expanding on what Kate was saying about the misconceptions of positive psychology, there can also be misconceptions with the language and interpretation used. So the language we use can be interpreted in different ways, as words can mean different things to different people and can have both negative and positive connotations depending upon the context they're in, and also depending upon individual bias and individual beliefs. So it's important to define what we mean when using a word to ensure that there is shared meaning and shared understanding. Just the words positive psychology arouses so many different connotations, with people having different beliefs as to what it is and how it can be applied. For example, when we think about the concept of happiness, this in itself is interpreted differently. So people often tend to associate happiness with feelings of pleasure, but this is perhaps a narrow perspective, as pleasure refers to more short-term feelings, such as what Kate was saying earlier, like eating a slice of cake or eating a slice of pizza whilst it's still nice and hot and delicious. And when you're eating this pizza, you may feel joy in that moment, but there's not really any longevity in this, as it's more of a short-lived notion. Whereas happiness in positive psychology is actually a broader concept. And in the perspective of psychologists and philosophers, happiness has a deeper meaning and is perhaps more long-term. And in Matthew Ricard's book, Happiness, A Guide to Developing Life's Most Important Skill, he defines happiness as a state of inner fulfillment, not the gratification of inexhaustible desires for outward things. So it's an important distinction to make when we're talking about happiness, that it's not just about seeking pleasure or fleeting emotions, but instead perhaps happiness is more about having a deep sense of flourishing that arises from a healthy mind and an optimal state of being. He also promotes the notion that happiness will mean different things to different people. So maybe take some time after the session today to reflect on what happiness means for you and try considering what a state of inner fulfillment means for you. So the context of happiness. Everyone wants happiness and chases happiness to some extent. But in her TED Talk, Emily Esfahani-Smith raises the idea that there is essentially more to just being happy. Her reasoning for this is that when we constantly chase happiness, it can actually cause us to possibly feel worse and become more unhappy. And this is because when we chase happiness, we're more likely to obsess over the failure. And as a result, we might end up feeling more hopeless and experience more negative emotions. So Emily therefore proposes the 4 pillars of happiness, which she defines as having meaning in your life. And actually there have been studies that have found that having this sense of meaning in life results in people being more resilient and performing better at work or at school. So the first pillar she describes as a central source of meaning is belonging. And so this is about having a sense that you belong to a group or a family and that you feel that you're valued, you're loved and appreciated for who you are. And having this positive sense of belonging leads people to have more of a positive self-regard. Secondly, she describes purpose. And so this is about having the feeling that you're making a contribution in whatever it is you're doing. It's essentially your sense of why and having the feeling that you're achieving something worthwhile. Thirdly, transcendence. So this is about stepping up beyond yourself and feeling connected to a higher reality, where you get so lost in the zone that you lose track of time and place. And people might experience this, for example, at church or through writing or doing a puzzle, for example. And this is actually a link here between what Kate was saying earlier about the theory of flow. The fourth and final pillar is storytelling. So this refers to what you tell yourself about yourself. It helps you to understand how you became you, as creating a narrative from the events of your life helps you to bring clarity. And psychologists have found that people who lead meaningful lives tend to tell stories that move from some kind of adversity to some sort of good. They consider a bad thing that has happened to them and then learn to realize how they grew as a result of it and perhaps the contribution that they are making to life or to society. So Emily explains that these 4 pillars, belonging, purpose, transcendence, and storytelling, are essentially the building blocks for a meaningful life. So how can this be applied in the workplace? Well, if we consider the impact of the first 2 pillars, so belonging and purpose, research has shown that people who have a strong sense, who have strong positive relationships at work, end up having greater job satisfaction. And secondly, having a sense that you are engaged and doing something purposeful has been found to be motivating. There's also a strong link between purpose and being able to do what they do well and playing to their strengths. And this is in fact something that we at Zircon and Be Talent greatly believe in. And so we therefore work with our clients to help them better identify understand, and leverage the strengths of their employees and leaders. So really, it's about creating an atmosphere at work where people have a strong sense of belonging, feel valued, and also feel like they're adding value, as this is likely to lead a workforce that feels happy and feel that they have meaning in their life. So we're now going to play a video in which one of our colleagues, Reese, interviewed Mari, who is a clinical research nurse. And in this interview, Reese explores with Mari questions around how she experiences purpose in her role, and also explains how her purpose has impacted her, particularly during the COVID-19 crisis.
I'm Mari Francis. I'm currently working as a research nurse. I work at the Institute for Global Health at University College London. I've been doing the job that I do for 5.5 years now, but I've been nursing for 22 years now. I've been qualified, so that makes me feel pretty old, which I probably am. I mean, work for me wasn't a choice, as it isn't for most people. You have to earn a living somehow, but I'm glad I did nursing and I stuck with it. Can't really imagine doing anything else. And I had a very short time away from nursing. I was still working in the healthcare field, but I did, and I never thought I'd miss patient care, but I only lasted about 6 months, and then I was back to nursing again.
In what way do you think this purpose has impacted you during COVID-19? Has it been helpful, or has it made things more challenging? Because I can imagine the role of a nurse during this is even more challenging than usual. So do you think that the purpose alignment with that has impacted that in any way?
I think it has, because it's influenced my decision making in terms of where to go during this COVID outbreak. So at the moment, the population I work with are homeless people. So either street homeless people who are sleeping rough, or people in hostels or shelters. I've been working with that group for 5.5 years now, but I'm a trained ITU nurse as well. Mm. So when COVID came along, it was sort of, do I stay where I am, or do I go back to intensive care? And it was a very long time ago I was an intensive care nurse, so that would have been sort of a large amount of retraining for me. But then when I thought about it, I thought actually there's probably more intensive care nurses than there are homeless healthcare nurses. And working with the group of patients that I do, I feel that it's useful to have experience of that group. Mm. And understanding their needs a bit more. Before I started working with homeless people, I used to be quite scared when they came into clinics or the hospital, because they were loud and they were shouting, and they were often heroin addicts and needed their methadone and needed the fix. And just throughout my nursing career, I've just really come to realise that that's not a choice that they've made. It's where life has taken them. And, nobody from well, I could be wrong, but I haven't come across anyone from a sort of emotionally secure and stable background that has gone into that life out of a choice. So, yeah. I mean, I'm quite, I'm very devoted to my own happiness, and I wouldn't do anything that would make me feel like a martyr, or that I would say I'm only doing this to, my happiness comes first, and so this just happens to make me happy. I don't know if that makes sense. It's not something that I do under duress. And I suppose Actually, that's another thing that, moving into my research job, there's lots of paperwork, it's quite academic. And, when I'm working with people who are fretting about deadlines and little things that go wrong, when you can say, well, look, nobody died, nobody got ill, we're okay.
Yeah.
So it's nice to, because I worked in areas where people did die and people got more sick, when mistakes were made or even when they weren't. So it's nice to look back and go, hey, this is nothing like as bad as that.
Mm.
So we hope you enjoyed the video. I'm now going to briefly explore the benefits behind a positive psychology approach, and then Helen will talk about how we can use positive psychology to our advantage, specifically in the current COVID-19 crisis. But firstly, when looking at the benefits of positive psychology, we look specifically back to Seligman's theory of positive psychology, then there are a number of benefits, particularly as it can be applied across various institutions. So, for example, it can be used in schools as the skills of well-being can be taught in schools to educate children about flourishing. It can be used at home as parents can utilize positive psychology to cultivate resilience and strengths in their children. In the workplace, organizations can raise their employees' well-being and increase employee performance. For example, the PERMA theory, which we talked about earlier, has actually informed many positive psychology interventions in the workplace, and these interventions have been found to improve organizational outcomes such as lower absenteeism rates, increased employee job satisfaction, and just in general produce higher workplace well-being levels. Lastly, it can also be applied in clinical settings, so therapists can apply it to prevent mental illness as well as heal those with mental illness through nurturing their patient's stress. More generally, first of all, actually, as we briefly touched upon earlier, positive psychology takes a strengths-based approach. And there's in fact a range of research which supports the importance of identifying and playing to our strengths. And research has found that individuals who are given the opportunity to identify and use their strengths, specifically at work, are 73% more engaged. They're also more motivated, and it can increase an individual's self-confidence. So more generally, the benefits of positive psychology is that it can be greatly valuable in changing someone's perspective, as it encourages someone to adopt a more optimistic outlook in life in order to achieve happiness and achieve fulfillment. And having this optimistic outlook therefore furnishes individuals with an upbeat spirit and motivational feelings, which can help them to achieve desired outcomes. Positive psychology can also help to boost self-esteem through beating self-doubt. And research suggests that it can also improve relationships. It can enhance well-being, and there are actually numerous positive psychology interventions, which I mentioned earlier, which are found to diminish stress and burnout and decrease symptoms of depression and anxiety. So I'll now pass you over to Helen, who's going to look at how we can use positive psychology to our advantage, particularly in the current pandemic.
Thank you, Caitlin. So I just want to take a moment to take a slight sidestep to look at the current situation that we're in, and then consider how we can use positive psychology to help us to cope. So we think about COVID-19 and the impact that it's having on our health. From people working at home and therefore not having the same work-life balance, to people on furlough and self-isolating, not having the same structure in their life or not being able to go out. This can have a massive impact on our psychological health and well-being. And some of the most commonly reported impacts are the loneliness pandemic, increased stress, and actually on a more positive note, psychological growth. The loneliness pandemic is around that one of the greatest human strengths is our desire to be connected, to help others, and to give back to others during times of stress. We crave hugs, closeness, eye contact, and togetherness. And in this especially challenging time, this can have mental challenges on our own selves, and has a consequence of the social isolation. It can cause us to feel lonely. And in many ways, the viral pandemic is fueling a loneliness pandemic, causing negative impacts on our psychological well-being. There's also an impact of having an increased stress levels. So during these challenging times, we're more likely to ruminate over the negative experiences that we're having, which can have suggested to have an impact on our psychological well-being, as well as our physiological health, as our blood pressure raises, as we ruminate more, and therefore we take longer levels of time to recover from psychological and physiological stress. Then finally, psychological growth. So research has shown that we can grow psychologically during extreme times of stress. So in fact, one study found that with Chinese survivors from an earthquake, that they actually found significant increased levels of post-traumatic psychological growth. And this links back to the work of Carol Dweck and the growth mindset that basically says that if we look for a positive in a situation, we can therefore become more resilient. So this leads me on nicely to how does positive psychology help in a global crisis? And the quote on the slide here just really sums that up, that if we look at and feel positive emotions in the midst of a global crisis, we can promote resilience. And so I'm going to go through 4 simple ways that we can use positive psychology in the COVID-19 situation to help with our psychological stress and well-being. So first of all, staying connected. Even in the midst of social distancing, it's important for us to stay connected with others. So this might be through telecoffees, virtual dinners, virtual pub quizzes, checking in on our friends and others in the community and letting them know how we think of them can help us to stay connected. Also having gratitude. So this is something I'll touch on a little bit later again when I look at how we can use a toolkit to help us in the situation. But more resilient people have been found to be more capable of moving on and finding happiness again. So similar to what Caitlin was talking about earlier. And if we think of people who make us feel loved, this gratitude in the face of tragedy can cause us to feel less depressive symptoms later on in life and in the later months. And so individuals who experience gratitude during stressful situations such as war, natural disasters, actually have found to report lower levels of PTSD. And so gratitude can arise from lots of simple gestures, and we'll look at these later on. Next is self-compassion. So this is about treating yourself like you are your best friend, even when you make a mistake, and saying that you've done something wrong or made the wrong decision, but it's okay. We are often compassionate and forgiving of others, but often not of ourselves. Self-compassion is about giving yourself that same manner of gentleness, rather than treating yourself with judgment or criticism. So treat yourself with kindness, just as you do with your best friends or even strangers. Pause and take a different vantage point and think about actually what situation am I currently in at the minute. And finally, there's refocusing your mind. So Seligman has recently created a simple exercise called Put It in Perspective, which starts to look at conjuring the worst case scenario, then thinking about the best case scenario, and finishing with the most likely scenario that's going to happen. And this idea redirects your thoughts from the irrational to the rational. And we're actually going to go through this 4-step process right now. So the first step is around reflection. So asking yourself, what is the worst possible situation? So this can change depending on your age, your health condition, and your personal situation. So for myself, it would be that either myself or one of my family members could get COVID-19 and die from it. The second step is visualizing the best possible outcome. So in this part of the exercise, I might think, well, I'll not get COVID-19 and nor will my family, and this will all blow over and it'll be fine. Then step 3 is about the reality, so the most likely thing that's going to happen. So in this scenario, I might think, well, I'll probably get infected eventually, but most adults that actually get COVID-19 actually don't get many symptoms or even just mild symptoms. And I'm not actually in the at-risk group, and I'm perfectly fit. So I'm unlikely to die from this situation. In fact, I'll only feel ill and then recover for a couple of weeks. And then finally, it's about moving forward and developing a plan for the future. So this is different from wasting time on something that is unlikely to occur, so thinking about that worst case scenario. Rather, it's thinking about a contingency plan for the future. So your plan will depend on your individual circumstances. For instance, do you need to book your child cover? Do you have enough food and medicine? And what does this mean for your own job? So hopefully that's given you a bit of an insight of how you can use positive psychology in your own life during the current situation at the moment. The next thing that I'm going to look at is positive psychology really for me? So positive psychology is an approach that can be leveraged, and it's not necessarily a philosophy that must be wholeheartedly adhered to. It's just to say that elements of positive psychology might benefit you, such as utilising strengths and putting these practices into your own life. Everything outlined already will hopefully have given you a perspective to recognise the value that positive psychology can bring, but it doesn't mean that you should employ this approach 100% of the time. In fact, the studies on the slide here show some instances of where positive psychology has not found to impact or benefit people, and actually when making decisions with an element of risk can have potential impacts for the future. While this slide relates specifically to these instances, when exploring the practices of positive psychology, you may find some elements really resonate with you, while others don't seem as attractive. And therefore, it's up to you to really think about the benefits of what it can bring into your life. So, for example, one way that you might find benefit from it is using what's known as an appreciation journal. There's psychological and scientific evidence to show that showing appreciation for things and people, as we discussed earlier, have an impact on our psychological well-being. And therefore, this is one way that you could use positive psychology that might benefit you, but that's your decision to make. Then finally, I'm going to look at the positive psychology toolkit. So if you read a lot about positive psychology, you'll find many activities that utilize and that you can utilize to support you building your positive psychology approach into life. And as you read these, you might find a lot of different support that may or may not work for you, as we've just outlined. And here on the slide are just a few things that you can leverage to help your approach into positive psychology. So the first is if you're working in business. Sarah Lewis's book, Positive Psychology in Business, is a great resource to find out applications of how you can use this philosophy and theory into your own leadership style. Then there's around using card sorts. So us at Be Talent and Zircon have developed a personal strengths card sort exercise where you can identify what your own personal strengths are and increase your awareness around those through a simple card sort exercise. And you can contact us if you're interested in looking into that and completing it. The third is around feedback conversations. So arguably this is the area that gives us the greatest insight into our own strengths and respective development areas, and getting perspective from others around what our strengths are. has significant impacts on our ability to develop and be successful. And then finally, there's De Bono's 6 hacks. So this is around using positive psychology when making decisions. So using 6 hats, such as caution and optimism, to help you make a decision by looking at it in different perspectives. And then finally, there's a few book suggestions on the slide, which gives you a little bit more information, including Sarah Lewis's book on positive psychology, and for you to be able to read about it further. And I think that's everything I have to share with you today. So thank you for listening, and I hope that you enjoyed it.